years, marked by frequent leadership changes, 7 presidents in the past 8 years, erosion of the rule of law. We've seen mass protests and human rights violations, all of which have deeply affected its democratic institutions and created widespread disillusionment with government. According to Vanderbilt's 2023 Latin American Public Opinion Poll report, only 1 in 2 Peruvians view democracy as the best form of government, and just 19% are satisfied with how democracy performs. Perhaps even more troubling, only 7% of Peruvians have trust in Congress, and the president has a dismal 8% approval rating. One consequence and also an indicator of the political and institutional instability is a significant increase in migration, which we can expect will grow even further if the situation does not change. In 2022, 400,000 Peruvians left the country, and that is close to 4 times the number that migrated in 2021. And in the first 6 months of 2023, the number grew even more dramatically to 415,000, on track to more than double the 2022 annual rate. Despite calls for dialogue and reform in Peru, substantial action towards resolution or reconciliation has been notably absent. As we convene today, we're going to have the opportunity to explore these issues in depth. We seek not only to understand the underlying causes and potential resolutions to the crisis, but also to consider its implications for democracy in Peru and beyond. And I'm going to turn it over to Michael Shifter now, who needs no introduction as former president of the Inter-American Dialogue and someone we're very lucky to have on as a senior fellow, and not to mention his deep expertise on Peru, who will moderate today's discussion and introduce our speakers. Michael, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, for your support for this event about a country that has long been of great interest to the dialogue and to me personally. And good morning to everybody who has joined us for this very, very important meeting. I would say today that Peru is, from a regional perspective, is not a central focus in Latin America, but it's an important country that arguably has been the harbinger of regional trends. And the most significant of these trends was the discrediting and crumbling of political parties and the election of a populist outsider in 1990, Alberto Fujimori. Nearly 35 years later, we are seeing similar process with varying national characteristics and features in countries such as Argentina, and even some hints in Sunday's election in Panama. This morning, we're going to explore Peru's evolution and the current situation with a focus on its politics and institutions, but also in the context of its economic performance and social conditions. Is democracy underpinned by the rule of law and separation of powers at some risk, or is the country going through changes in how politics function, with shifting alliances and empowered Congress, but within the constitutional order with little to worry about? Is this just another moment in what seems like Peru's perpetual political crisis, or is it something more serious? To be sure, there have been troubling signs that suggest backsliding in the country. The current president, as Rebecca mentioned, and the Congress are deeply unpopular, the most unpopular Congress and most unpopular president in all of Latin America. And recent corruption scandals involving both the president and the Congress have only deepened distrust. Human rights abuses committed by security forces against protesters some 18 months ago were egregious by any measure, and to date they have not been fully investigated and no one has been held to account. Congress has continued its efforts to undermine the judiciary by dismantling the National Board of Justice, which selects and evaluates judges and prosecutors. And the board is also charged with protecting the independence of the electoral system. Many human rights groups and democracy organizations, as well as the OAS and the United Nations, have called attention to threats to judicial independence. Also of great concern is persecution of the independent press, a pillar of democracy. The Committee to Protect Journalists, the National Press Club, and other credible groups that monitor press freedom have criticized Peru's legal system for attempting to muzzle Gustavo Gorriti, one of Latin America's most respected and renowned investigative journalists and the director of IDL Reporteros. Last July, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights of the OAS granted precautionary measures to Gorriti, who is a close friend of mine and who has participated in dialogue events in Lima and in Washington over many, many years. We're very fortunate this morning to have three superb speakers to talk about the complex and uncertain situation in Peru. The aim is not only to gain a better understanding of what is happening today, but also to discuss the outlook and possible scenarios over the next 2 years when elections are scheduled to take place. Let me introduce them briefly, and if you want to review their full bios, please consult the Dialogue's website. Gino Costa is the former minister and vice minister of Interior, who also served as a member of Peru's Congress from 2016 to 2021. He is widely consulted on a variety of issues such as police reform, citizen security, and human rights. Gino was an active member of the Dialogue's Latin American Working Group for 15 years. Currently, he's affiliated with the Institute of Peruvian Studies in Lima, where he is researching democracy in Peru. Carolina Trivelli is a former Minister of Development and Social Inclusion in Peru. She is a noted economist, a respected columnist for El Comercio and Gestión, and has had considerable expertise on issues of poverty reduction, food insecurity, and fiscal sustainability. She was recently recognized as among the most influential by Forbes magazine as among the most influential economists in Peru. So we congratulate her for that recognition. And she is currently a senior researcher with the Institute of Peruvian Studies. Will Freeman is a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations based in New York. He holds a doctorate in politics from Princeton University and has conducted research on judiciary's efforts to sanction corruption in Peru as well as in Guatemala and Colombia. He is remarkably prolific and has published in the most prestigious U.S. publications. So it's hard to imagine three better speakers to help us go through this very complicated and challenging situation in Peru. I'm going to pose questions to each speaker and try to do 2 rounds, and then we'll leave time for your questions at the end of the session. I'll invite you to use the Q&A feature to pose your questions to the speakers, and we hope to get to as many of them at the conclusion of the session. Let me start with Gino and ask him to tell us a little bit about the current situation, about Peruvian politics and institutional crisis. The Peru politics have long been pretty problematic and precarious. So help us understand, try to put this moment in context and give some perspective. How is this different from the political crisis that we've seen for many years in Peru, certainly since I lived in Peru in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but continuing on, when there's discussion about politics, it's usually there's a crisis adjective that's attached to it. You've written 2 recent books, Gino, the excellent book, Democracy Under Siege, which is the account, your account, personal account of the political crisis while you served in Congress from 2016. And you have a more recent book out on the failed government of Pedro Castillo. So perhaps you can get us started and talk about the current moment and how you see things right now. Turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Roberta, and good morning to everybody. Yes, indeed, Peruvian democracy is in danger. Since 2016, it has been deteriorating rapidly. 6 presidents in 8 years, a dissolved Congress, a coup d'etat, and the violent repression of the protests that follow. The crisis is explained, among other reasons, by the refusal of the loser of the last two elections to accept the results, governments without a parliamentary majority, successive corruption scandals, and the pandemic. The 2021 elections deepened the crisis. As an outsider anti-system candidate with no political experience won, ending the consensus on the market model and leaving a divided country. With prior agreement with his adversaries, Boluarte switched sides, pledged to stay until 2026 instead of holding early elections, and violently repressed the protests. The business, media, and military elites prefer to support an unpopular but friendly government that would bring stability rather than a new electoral process with the same actors and unpredictable results. However, Boluarte has failed to reactivate private investment or stop violence, is under investigation for illicit enrichment and corruption, and may not make it to 2026. Today, the dissatisfaction with democracy is among the highest in the hemisphere, and political fragmentation and institutional deterioration is worsening. Boluarte does not exceed 10% approval, and Congress is at 5%. The government is subordinated to an increasingly populist Congress, which is soft on corruption, caters to all sorts of informal and criminal interests, and seeks to control the other public powers to ensure impunity. Parliament already controls the Constitutional Tribunal, the Ombudsman's Office, and until recently, the Public Prosecutor's Office, until the suspension of Patricia Benavides. Now it aims to remain controlled with her return, as well as to capture the National Council of Justice to interfere with the judicial and electoral systems. Today, the heart of the institutional dispute is Patricia Benavides, who was crucial to expose Castillo's corruption, but whose true nature Peruvians were only going to discover later. First, Benavides shelved an investigation against her judge sister for releasing two drug traffickers in exchange for a bribe, which turned out to be a systematic practice of the chamber she participated in between 2012 and 2015. To ensure the removal by Congress of the National Council of Justice that was prosecuting her, she shelved investigations against dozens of congressmen. Finally, she weakened the prosecution teams investigating death in protests and major cases of political, judicial, and business corruption. The National Council of Justice, responsible for appointing and removing judges and prosecutors, first suspended Benavides for 6 months and then called for her removal, but thus far has been unable to make it happen because Congress and the Constitutional Tribunal interfere. If the deadlock is not resolved, Benavides will return to the Public Prosecutor's Office in 4 weeks. It will be the triumph of impunity for human rights violations, corruption, and organized crime. A real shame.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Gino, for those remarks. And I think you painted a pretty clear picture of the current situation. Why don't we turn now to Carolina for some opening remarks and maybe to talk a little bit about, Gino referred to this, about the economic situation and private investment, how this is affecting private investment, but it would be very useful to get your perspective on that, on the current situation and the social situation in Peru. We know that Peru had a recession last year, but is supposed to recover somewhat in 2024. I think during COVID, Peru had the highest per capita death rate in the world, if I'm not mistaken. And so there must be lingering social effects. So tell us a little about the Peruvian economy and the social conditions in the country today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning to everybody. Thank you to the dialogue for the invitation. Peruvian economy is still a very strong economy in macroeconomic terms and in fiscal terms, especially when compared to the other countries in the region. We have a very low debt. We have enough international reserves. We have a strong central bank. We were able to really control the impact of high inflation coming from the global economy, but it is deteriorating very fast. We saw that deterioration happening very quickly in the last 2-3 years, with last year being the worst year in more than 22 years. In terms of growth, in terms of fiscal deficit, and in terms of job creation, which is one of the striking issues of this for the social conditions in the country, and that is directly related to private investment. And that is the cornerstone of the main economic discussions today. We have a strong macroeconomic situation compared to our neighbors, and we have a decent picture in terms of macroeconomic situation. But when we see the full movie from the last 20 years, we see a situation that is not improving, that is having a lot of new issues arising, and we are ending our good savings of the past 20 years. The good news for the macroeconomic situation is that this year, 2024, it's going to be a year that will look a lot better. Partly because last year was a really bad year. So we will have a statistical image of a growing economy, around 3% for this year. And we will have also a consumption bubble that will be, that is artificially created by the Congress that allow, for the 7th time, access to pension funds for the people that still have some pension funds after 7 times when we were able to take some money out. Informality is still too high, around 75%. It is decreasing, but it is decreasing because everything in terms of in the labor market is decreasing. So we are not in a very good position to say that we are moving to formality. That is not the case in the Peruvian economy. So labor market is in the center of our economic distress, and that has to do with private investment. And as Gino was saying, private investors are really scared about what's going to happen in this country with this political situation that now is not only affecting the political discussion, but that is really attacking the main reforms and the main institutions, including the economic institutions of the country, day by day. So the Congress is here, the main source of distress for the economic situation, and the national government, as our Minister of Economic and Finance said last week, is a very weak government, and they have to accept whatever the congressman say, decide, propose, and they just write the check. So with little savings, writing the check for the Congress initiatives is not always possible, and that will create a lot more instability. All this economic situation translates into a sustained poverty increase. We will have the official estimations of poverty for last year at the end of this week by the national authority. But for sure, poverty will have increased again because we didn't have any growth last year. We still had some inflation affecting especially food consumption, and we didn't have a recovery of the labor markets. So we are back in the situation in which every year poverty is increasing, although probably this year things will stop deteriorating, but will not improve necessarily because we will not have enough growth. 3% will not reduce automatically poverty rates. We will control finally inflation, and that will be a relief for most of the people. People are really worried today about the minimum conditions they need to survive. And they don't have time to be fighting for, political change because they think that will not solve their problems. They want to work. And that's what people are doing, seeking for a second job, seeking for new economic opportunities, building communal solutions to face food crisis, like soup kitchens and stuff like that around the social environment. But they are not really having enough time to go to the streets because they think that is not going to solve their problems. And I think that is a critical change in the social situation of Peruvians. They don't see that pushing the government for solutions for their day-to-day problems is an option. That's a waste of time. The citizens really don't trust the government as someone that could really relieve their problems. They need to find their own solutions privately. And I think that is the key to understand why we really have those results in terms of democratic support.
Great. Thank you very much. It was excellent. Let me turn now to Will. And Will, you've been sounding the alarm about Peru. And perhaps you can tell us what concerns you or worries you most, and how serious is democratic backsliding, and perhaps try to put it in a regional context of how you see Peru. And you've studied Guatemala and written about Guatemala and other countries, and so would really welcome your reflections on this. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael and Rebecca and the dialogue for bringing us all together. Couldn't agree more that although Peru's not always or even often in the headlines in the United States, this is a country that we need to be discussing more. It does matter for us, for national security interests and the country as a whole. In the US, we're talking about the fifth most populous country in Latin America, the sixth biggest economy, a country which is very important in terms of critical minerals and critical mineral supply chains that affect U.S. national security interests. So I couldn't be happier that we're talking about Peru today, especially as it reaches this really concerning inflection point or turning point, which I think both Gino and Carolina have underscored very effectively. So let me add this. When I look across the region today, I see no country in which democracy and the rule of law are deteriorating more quickly than in Peru. Now, note, I did not say that the countries where democracy and rule of law are most broken. Of course not. I mean, Peru is not Nicaragua, obviously, right? It's not even El Salvador. But the backsliding is happening very rapidly. People worry these days about democratic backsliding in Mexico, Honduras, Bolivia, all with good reason. But I find it curious that we often hear more about what's happening in those countries than Peru itself. So let's talk about what's happening in Peru. I think democratic backsliding in Peru has taken on quite an unusual form, at least if you look across the last few decades of Latin American history. Usually in Latin America, you see a power-concentrating president, think Nayib Bukele or Hugo Chavez before him, who concentrates authority in the executive, disempowers regulatory institutions and checks on power, and generally organizes one party or clique of supporters around himself. In Peru, what we're seeing is backsliding by a coalition of factions, which I think if we're going to be honest here and frank about it, you could call Fujimorismo and friends. It's the Fujimorista Party, Fuerza Popular, and several aligned political blocs or parties that are each steered by their own political operators and tend to vote with Fuerza Popular on key institutional changes. So this is democratic backsliding driven by and for the benefit of Congress. That's what makes it different. And I think that's why often we've been missing it in the public conversation. Now, to put it in context, why is this coalition of parties led by Fuerza Popular leading this effort to erode democracy? I think it's a clear response to the last 10 years of Peruvian politics, in which you saw an increasingly assertive and independent judiciary investigating illicit campaign finance, which had become somewhat the glue or the motor fuel of the Peruvian political system. So you saw prosecutors really start to probe that issue. This, I think, is the response by those affected parties. You look at the parties that form part of this autocratic coalition, which I've been discussing, they have one common denominator. They were all investigated at some point for illicit campaign finance. Now, I realize there might be some skeptics in the audience. I've encountered plenty of people, and I think they're reasonable to ask these questions, to ask, well, how do we know that democracy is really eroding here? It's not just a threat on the horizon. So let me briefly point to three indicators, three flashing red lights that I see. I think if we talk about democracy in the region, you have to consider three things. An independent judiciary that's actually equipped to hold whether they're lawmakers or presidents accountable. I think you need, when you're talking about a democracy, a system in which big structural changes to the Constitution, to the form of government itself, come with popular consent, where people have an opportunity to weigh in on such changes. And third, I think you need a system in which elections are overseen by neutral referees. So electoral authorities that are not afraid of facing retaliation for doing their jobs, for organizing elections on a fair playing field. And on each of those dimensions of democracy, the judicial independence, popular ratification of constitutional change, and the independence of electoral authorities, I think we've seen huge backsliding in the past year in Peru. So just briefly on each of those. First, we've seen a tireless assault by these factions in Congress, led by Fuerza Popular, against the National Justice Board, which, Michael, you mentioned in the beginning. That sounds obscure, but it's a very important judicial body which names and ratifies judges and prosecutors across the country and has a hand in also appointing electoral authorities. So you can imagine how significant it is that Congress has not only tried multiple times to purge the members of this junta on spurious grounds, but is now, as of, I believe today or the day before, has a bill that will be voted on in the full Congress to actually dissolve the National Justice Board entirely and replace it with new entities, which would be much more under the thumb of Congress itself. But that's not all when it comes to the judicial independence and it's the erosion of that independence. We've also seen Congress put in place lenient or loyalist judges in the Constitutional Tribunal, which have cut back the ability of the judiciary to actually review decisions by Congress. And we've also seen Congress tie the hands of prosecutors fighting organized crime. We've seen them dismantle the plea bargaining tools, which are so essential to determine how any criminal structure works. Now, on the changes to the Constitution, we've also seen sweeping change there. I would compare this to the constituent assemblies that Hugo Chavez or Rafael Correa held in the 2000s. In Peru, we've seen over 50 articles of the Constitution changed recently. The only difference, of course, with those earlier cases I mentioned, in those earlier cases, Correa, Chavez, there were anti-democratic changes to the Constitution, but they had broad popular support, unfortunately. The difference in Peru is that there's no popular support for Congress's dismantling of the Constitution. In fact, several of the key parts of the Constitution, Congress has changed. For instance, the creation of a Senate, a very powerful upper house that will come into effect in 2026, or the de facto elimination of re-election bans on members of Congress. Both of those items were overwhelmingly voted down by voters in a 2018 referendum. That's the last time the Peruvian people had a chance to weigh in on these key constitutional questions. And it seems that if Congress gets its way, there will be no further chances to weigh in on these key issues of institutional design. So to zoom out there, I think we're seeing a wholesale remaking of the Peruvian Constitution, tantamount to writing a new one, but with no chance for the people to weigh in, because certainly they would say no to this. And then finally, on free and fair elections, and here's what's really critical. 2026, the next elections in Peru, will be overseen, as usual, by and organized by the National Office of Electoral Processes. The voter rolls will be organized by an institution called RENIEC. And there will be, in case of any disputes, the electoral courts there to settle them and to weigh in. What's really concerning is that we're not only seeing assaults on judges and prosecutors, we're not only seeing changes to the Constitution, we're now seeing the coalition in Congress take aim against these very electoral institutions. One, by investigating some of their heads. So we've seen investigations against Jorge Salazar Arenas, the head of the the electoral court, which seems to be a plain retaliation against his decision to not comply with an attempt to defraud the 2021 elections. And beyond that, a new bill that's been tabled or put on the table in Congress would actually have this new Senate that will exist in 2026 be the authority that will single-handedly choose the heads of the electoral office, the National Office of Electoral Processes, and the RENIEC, the institution that manages the voter rolls. Imagine that. You would have lawmakers choosing, hand-selecting the very people who are organizing elections and administering the voter rolls. It takes no stretch of the imagination to point out why that's concerning for democracy. So I'll just conclude with this. Sometimes in Peru, this debate around all these momentous changes that are happening in the country gets boiled down to what some people claim is a battle between the so-called caviars, the idea that there's sort of an upper class, upper middle class, left-leaning intelligentsia in Lima, versus the kind of true heart of the Peruvian people, the sort of bottom-up, center-right or conservative Fujimorista bloc. I don't think that describes, if it ever did, it no longer describes what's happening in the country. You look at any polls, 80 to 90% of Peruvians disapprove of the direction the country is going. Clearly, many of those people do lean to the right. They might even lean quite far to the right. They also lean to the left. They're in the center. They come from the highlands. They come from the cities along the coast. What we see is majority of Peruvians rejecting the direction the country is moving, but Congress not slowing down and in fact speeding up with these very concerning changes. So, just a final point here, 2026, I think the assumption in the United States especially is that, well, we don't really need to tune in to Peru until then. That will be the chance for Peruvians to push the reset button if they like. At that point, we'll have free and fair elections as we've had since the year, since every year after 2000 in Peru. But for all the reasons I've just listed, I think everyone here should consider and take seriously the possibility that 2026 will not be a chance to hit the reset button, and in fact, that button may no longer exist.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Will. That was terrific. Why don't we, I'm going to move now to a second round of questions. I think we really got some excellent points have been made by our three speakers, but let me turn back to Gino. First, if you want to comment on anything that Will said or Carolina said, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the sort of the scenarios you see moving forward to 2026. Carolina made the point that people are just kind of trying to get by in a very, very difficult economic situation, which suggests that we probably shouldn't expect great, street mobilizations of civil society and Peruvian citizens to express their discontent with both the president and the Congress. And also, so how do you see this playing out? And also, if you could comment a little bit on Will's point about the constitutional reform and the creation of a Senate and re-election. Of course, when you were in Congress, I was always hoping that there would be re-election because I wanted you to serve another term, but I guess you couldn't. So, what do you think is behind this constitutional reform? Is there actually a sort of a thought out plan in Congress, or is this just being improvised in a way? And are there any prospects for political reform? Is that possible to imagine given the composition of the current Congress? So those are a few questions, and look forward to any responses.
Thanks, Mike. I very much agree with Carolina's and Will's assessment. I'll start by saying that last year, the relentless struggle of Congress to dismantle the National Council of Justice was aimed at protecting Patricia Benavides, as I have stated. No, both the current council and the next one, which will take office next year, are now in the sights of Congress because Congress wants to control the justice and electoral system, as Will has pointed out. The new council is elected under the supervision of an international panel of experts convened by the Due Process of Law Foundation. Perhaps that is why, among other reasons, at this very moment, Congress is trying to replace it with a magistrates' academy that will not have disciplinary functions. An outrage, really. Although these changes are of a constitutional nature, the discussion only began weeks ago, and the bill will most probably be voted in the coming days. In a nutshell, it shows Parliament's lack of transparency and the way it ignores public opinion and abuses of its overwhelming majority. Similar changes are being made in view of 2026. For instance, the Senate will return and the prohibition of re-election lifted. Both changes are positive, although highly unpopular. And they went through Congress without great debate because they will give current congressmen more chances to remain in power despite their discredit. To ensure the continuity of the current and popular parliamentarians, the control of the electoral authorities and the justice system is essential so that politicians have a greater influence in determining who competes and who wins. Independent judges and attorneys are the only institutional force that counterbalances the authoritarian strategy pursued by Congress, which, although massively rejected by the public, is not being fought back in the streets. Freedom of the press, expression, and information are also under constant threat. Of special concern are the campaigns against independent journalists, accompanied by violent harassment by extreme right-wing groups, whose most recurring victims are Gustavo Orriti and Rosa Maria Palacio. One of the aims of the ruling coalition is to have Peru withdraw from the international system of human rights, following the example of Venezuela and Nicaragua, and before of Alberto Fujimori. The international community so far has played an important role in preventing the destruction of Peruvian democracy. It should continue to do so. Let's hope that the OAS Permanent Council, which has already shown an interest in the fragile state of our institutions, do so again, especially in the face of these new threats.
Great. Thank you very much. Carolina, let me turn back to you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you sort of made a really, a very vivid description of the situation and the acute conditions facing most Peruvians. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether there's any action or any response by the government or by Congress, and also any external institutions, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. How helpful, have they been? Are they pursuing the right policies in your judgment, as trying to address this acute poverty and situation in the country?
Mike, let me begin saying that I think that there's a lot of social discontent, and there's a growing interest from citizens on politics and on policy discussions. But what I'm saying is that the motivation for that unrest is not going to come from asking for economic support from the government. Mm-hmm. That is something that is completely out of the scope. No, also government implements a great social policy or a great employment gonna help them, really. So people is really worried about surviving day to day. And each of those survival challenges that comes every single day are involving 20 hours of the day of the people. So there's a disconnection between the domestic economy of each person and the economic situation of the country. The link of both is the labor market, employment, decent employment, good employment, better salaries, more demand in the sectors affecting the more poorer people in the country. And those are agriculture, construction, services, and commerce. Those are the key sectors to change the economic situation of the people living in poverty in Peru today. So what are we doing as a country to move those sectors? Very little. And that's the main point. The international organizations are trying to promote changes in policies to support private investment, to increase productivity, to increase formality, but they don't have anybody to work with. The public sector has been losing the best people working there, and now you really don't have nobody to work with in real terms. It's not only about not having enough money, not having enough political will, you don't have enough hands in the public sector to do something that is transformative. On the other side, you have the Congress that is doing all these ultra popular things like allowing people to get access to their pension funds or to get access to the sort of unemployment insurance you have here, the CTS, and nothing more, or doing all these populist things that allow public servants to increase their salaries, but with no capacity for the public sector to attract the good people that could make something different. So we will have this bubble this year with better macroeconomic conditions because prices of copper and gold are ultra high, and that will be a temporal relief for our economy. But things are not working. We are not doing nothing new. We are allowing our economy to work as 10 years ago. And the situation today is completely different. And we are not making any adjustments to how we address social policies, economic policies, labor policies to really address the demands of the people today. And I think that is the main disconnection between what the people want in economic and needs in economic terms and what the politicians are thinking about.
Just if I could quick follow-up, what are the implications of that for the role of, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank? I mean, do they have any influence?
They're struggling to offer support, to offer loans to the country because they don't have a demand, because there are no identified ideas of things we want to change, we want to address. We are just doing business as usual, as if we were in the situation of 10 years ago. And that is the main problem. We don't have, it's not that we're lacking money or resources or ideas to do something different. We don't want to do anything different from our economic institutions.
Great.
Mike, if I could add to Carolina's, in the case of the health system, I understand that the World Bank was discussing, had approved a $200 million project for institutional support of the ministry. After the pandemic, we were the hardest hit in the world.
Right.
And after a few months, it gave up and closed down the project because it had no counterparts, which is exactly what Carolina has been saying.
Yeah,
it's a good example.
Very, very good point. I think it's very, very telling, very revealing, that point. Let me turn to Will, and you've really given us a very compelling and I think troubling picture of the threats to democracy in Peru. And I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about it. I mean, Gino mentioned the Organization of American States. I know there's been some statements from the U.S. Congress, maybe not getting the attention it deserves, but how do you see if it got more attention, what kind of attention would be most effective, do you think, in trying to perhaps, slowing down the backsliding, if we call it that way, or even more optimistically leading to some sort of democratic strengthening in Peru? And also, if you could elaborate a little bit on the Guatemala comparison, because a lot of people have made that comparison. Are there similarities in terms of how this is working with the Congress and the executive, and also in terms of the international response? Are there lessons from Guatemala that might be relevant for Peru?
Great questions. Thank you, Michael. So I'll talk about what I perceive in conversations in Washington and in terms of foreign partners of Peru. I get the perception that there's an immense amount of fatigue and confusion surrounding the situation in Peru. And look, I understand this is a time in which the U.S. is in its engagement in the region is facing crisis in Haiti, very critical moment in Venezuela. If U.S. foreign policymakers look further south than that, they're probably looking at Ecuador, a country on the verge of becoming a narco state. And of course, there's the issue of migration, critically important for our country and for our upcoming election. So I understand that bandwidth is limited. The situation in Peru is confusing because, as I underscored in my earlier comments, there's not one president certainly concentrating power. There is an autocratic coalition of factions in Congress that's wearing away the safeguards for democracy and conditions for free and fair elections. So I think it's a situation that does not get the attention that it deserves, especially when you think about the size of the country. Because if democracy melts down and there's further large-scale outmigration from a country as big as Peru, we will start talking about it, I think, quite soon. So where does this fatigue and confusion come from? Look, I think this is really a legacy of the Pedro Castillo government. Obviously, we saw unprecedented government instability during that time, constant rotation in the ministries, and ultimately Castillo's anti-democratic move to try to attempt an autogolpe, which quickly failed. So I think there's a lot of cynicism and fatigue left over from that chapter, a sense that, well, at least, and I've heard this verbatim many times, at least Peru is stable now. But where I see that falling short and actually being very misguided is that I think this is, if you can call it any kind of stability at all, it's the precursor to an explosion. Peru, as I see it, is a powder keg. I mean, like, let's take a slightly deeper look at the situation. You have maybe the most unpopular government in all of the Americas, both Congress and the presidency. If we believe the Ipsos polls or other international polling agencies, the government with less of a base of popular support than Nicolas Maduro, the dictator of Venezuela. So that's for one thing. I think that although we've seen a lull in protests, as Carolina mentioned, based on the history of Peru over the last 10 years, sooner or later, we will see new explosive protests. So this stability is going to be short-lived. In fact, I think the markets have been a bit more clear-sighted about just how dangerous the situation is than sometimes even policymakers. You had S&P recently, S&P Global downgrade Peru's long-term foreign currency sovereign credit rating to BBB minus, citing the limited political capital of the administration, which weighs on private sector investment sentiment. So a nice way of saying that this is the least popular government in the entire region. It can't sustain itself this way. Second, we see surging migration. I've written about this recently. Michael, as you mentioned up front, over 400,000 people leaving the country 2022, another 400,000 just in the first 6 months of 2023. At the U.S. southern border, encounters by CBP with Peruvians trailed just behind the number for Haitians and Nicaraguans. And now, as of a few weeks ago, Mexico has imposed visa requirements on Peruvians who, as they headed north, were mostly flying to airports in Mexico and then continuing north on foot. So I think in the Darien, we're about to see a very critical situation involving Peruvians potentially. So this all makes the situation really worth paying attention to. I just want to make those points up front, why this matters for outside, actors outside Peru, why it matters for Washington. It's because we do see a migration crisis burgeoning. I think we are likely to see more political instability given the illegitimacy of the status quo. So what could the outside response look like, or what should concerned foreign actors be doing here? So first, I think it's important to underscore something. There is a possibility still to avert the worst case outcome here. When I described backsliding earlier, it might have, as you mentioned, Michael, sound very dismal, very troubling. But I think that still quite a bit of the institutions that Peru has built since the year 2000, the independent judiciary, electoral authorities that are neutral, still much of that for now, emphasis on for now, remains intact. So I think with even a moderate amount of international attention and pressure on this issue, we can help the majority in Peru keep it that way, which is clearly what the majority of Peruvians want. I think the goal here for US foreign policy or the OAS or any international actor should be preserve what Peru already has going for it, which is the structural elements, the sort of the basic infrastructure you need for free and fair elections in 2026. An infrastructure that's very much under threat as a result of these recent bills I've mentioned that would completely change how the electoral authorities are appointed. Concretely, what would this look like? I think that the United States should be much more strongly and consistently messaging that Peru already has democratic institutions, that it doesn't need an overhaul, let alone one that doesn't have the support of the people. I think that, frankly, if I were in the driver's seat here, there should be at least an active discussion about the possibility of targeted sanctions against members of Peru's Congress who already investigated for corruption, significant ties to illicit campaign finance networks, are pushing forward these changes. We saw in Guatemala that even the threat of targeted sanctions against lawmakers can be quite significant in terms of staunching the bleeding and stopping a democratic backsliding process. I think Peru would be quite similar to that. There may be elements of the authoritarian coalition I've been discussing that simply won't feel the effects of sanctions or don't care. I think there you can talk about the political groups around Jose Luna Galvez and the Serronistas, the ex-followers of Pedro Castillo. But I do think there's also factions that occasionally take part in these anti-democratic votes in Congress, which are much more on the fence and can actually be reasoned with and be kind of convinced that it's worth preserving democracy. I'm thinking here of Cesar Acuña's political bloc, the Alliance for Progress, and even Keiko Fujimori herself, who harbors presidential ambitions, will certainly be a part of the country's politics in years to come. And I think, if she feels that there are eyes on Peru internationally and that there would be consequences for pushing this process of democratic backsliding further, that she also might take a big step back from some of the most egregious recent efforts we've seen to dismantle democracy. Finally, of course, this can't and shouldn't be unilateral. I think there's a role for the OAS to play here, which is experiencing its own resurgence, I would say, after its very successful role in Guatemala. What could this look like? I think a good starting point would be to call a permanent council special session. Wouldn't have to be driven or led by the United States either. Guatemala itself has a new permanent representative to the OAS. Guatemala's just been through a very similar process to the one Peru is experiencing now. I think Guatemala would be very well positioned to drive this forward. And look, we can look at the governments of Mexico, Colombia. We know that they're far from consistent when they criticize democratic backsliding in the region, right? I mean, they tend to focus much more on the cases in which conservative incumbents are the ones eroding democracy, not so much in the cases where it's the left doing it, as in Honduras right now. But I do think that politically, in terms of the OAS member states, there would be quite a bit of support to put more focus on Peru. The situation in Peru is one that Mexican President López Obrador criticized early on. It's one that Gustavo Petro was vocal in warning about. And I think what we need to see now is sort of broad consensus that rises above ideology. We need to see countries across the region starting to pay attention to this situation. Because again, and I'll conclude with this, I don't think that the region can afford a large-scale escalating crisis in a country as big as Peru. We're talking over 35 million people, a migration crisis which seems to be starting from that country. And the real possibility that if we see democracy further erode and we don't see free and fair elections in 2026, we could start to see a story play out that we've seen in countries before. That's one in which organized crime becomes more powerful, economic stagnation becomes permanent, And at the end of the day, more and more people simply can't see a future for themselves and their children in the country where they're born. And so they opt for migration. Again, I still think that the hopeful, the positive silver lining here is that there is time to act, but it's going to require some action quite quickly, I think.
Great. That was terrific. Great. Actually, let me open. We're gonna take some questions now from the public. There are a lot of them. Let me first go to Rebecca to ask the first question, and then I have some others here. Rebecca, I think you're on
Thank you,
mute.
Michael, and thank you to all of the speakers. Will mentioned when he was talking about indicators of the subversion of the rule of law in the courts, mentioned this attempt to kind of tie the hands of prosecutors that are investigating links to organized crime. So my question is, and maybe Gino, you're the one to answer this as the former Minister of Security, is about the role of organized crime in Peruvian politics. I mean, I think we're talking more and more about organized crime, especially as we see things really unravel in Ecuador, and we talk about the growing citizen insecurity, but we don't talk as much about the impact on governance, the penetration of government, penetration of the state. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Great, thanks. This was a question also, Cindy Aronson had asked a very similar question in the Q&A. So let me turn to Gino first, and maybe Will would want to add something. But, organized crime, Cindy in her question asked, Peru, its longstanding role in the cocaine trade. If you can address that issue, and of course the politics connection, as Rebecca asked.
Yeah. Drug trafficking, the production of cocaine has nearly doubled since 2017. And with the current prices of gold, illegal mining of gold has, been extremely profitable and increasingly growing. Although we don't have any numbers, prices have never been as high as they are now, and have increased certainly in the last 5 or 6 years. Then there's an indication of the new presence of Brazilian criminal organizations in the Peruvian Amazon region, of Ecuadorian criminal organizations in the north of the country, and of Tren de Aragua, of course, as everywhere else in South America. These are new developments, coupled with the growing influence of those interests in the conduct of Congress. The legislative record of this Congress accounts for the furthering of the interests of drug trafficking, of illegal logging, of illegal mining, of course. Most notably, the decision to eliminate in practice the plea bargain mechanism, as has been mentioned by Will. But the list is extremely long of all the decisions taken by Congress to benefit criminal interests. Although those that belong to the coalition that runs Congress, that goes from the extreme right to the extreme left, are extremely keen with the possibility of a Peruvian Bukele. In actual fact, they are extremely soft on crime, and especially organized crime. So the success of this authoritarian drive by Congress would end up with an authoritarian regime that, instead of being strong against crime and corruption, will be weak against crime and corruption, which is, an additional, the main important, or one of the main important dangers behind, the erosion of Peruvian democracy these days.
Great, thanks. Will, do you like to add something to that?
Yeah, only just one thing about why I agree with everything Gino said. I think now is the worst possible time to be weakening prosecutors who focus on organized crime of all things in Peru. And just one note there on why the timing matters. I mean, I think we're seeing a real change in how organized crime works transnationally in Latin America. As we've seen a shift towards maritime cocaine smuggling, cocaine smugglers are putting ever more higher a premium on infiltrating their way into ports that don't tend to attract as much attention. So that's the story we saw with Ecuador. And there have been recent media reports that some of the same Albanian mafia figures, so critical in Ecuador's unraveling, have now set up shop in Peru. So I think that although Peru is a country that has been relatively safe by Latin American standards, relatively nonviolent for a couple decades now, and it's a country in which homicides, we have to acknowledge, went down last year nationally. I think that we can't take for granted anymore that there are some countries that just don't have to worry about organized crime as much as other ones. So again, that's why for me, it's especially concerning that we see moves like, as Gino mentioned, the what's called the anti-forestry law, this law that very much weakens protections against illegal logging. It's why it's concerning to me that we've even seen President Dina Boluarte float the kind of regularization of illegal mining in a country in which that industry is producing 2 to 3 times as much profits as drug trafficking is. Yeah, I think I mean, as Gino mentioned, there's this is not the time to be tampering with law enforcement, let alone depriving it of the tools it needs to dismantle some of these networks.
Mike,
Mike, and
let me add something.
Carolina, yeah.
Very, very small thing, but crucial here about these illegal economies developing all around the country. They have a huge territorial impact. They are highly located in certain places, and they have also some local authorities with them. And that is changing the scope of local politics also in the country. Sorry for my dog.
Great. No, that's great. Carolina, there's a question from an anonymous participant, but I wanted to ask you, we really haven't talked about the role of the private sector. And this is, Will mentioned the S&P rating and the new rating. Is the private sector also very frustrated with this government? Do you see them as a potential, catalyst for some sort of change in Peru? Because obviously they're also, getting hurt by what the current situation. Is there some discussion within the private sector about about its role given the situation?
Actually, the sector is diverse, but if we are talking about the biggers, the bankers, companies, they are very worried because of the potential downgrading and losing our privileges in the investment world. But there's also a very large private sector that is taking advantage of the counter reforms and the institutional weakness of the country, dealing with illegal economies, with informal markets, and with creative ways of doing business. So there's a huge tension within the private sector of how this more illegal, informal, creative private sector is taking benefits and growing. And we are all concentrated in discussing how the other private sector is not investing enough. So I think it's very bad news having this, not only this trust from the private sector about the potential benefit, but this fight within the private sector that are mining the economic industry.
Okay, I think you're breaking up a little bit, but thank you. Why don't we go to another question, maybe for Gino and also for Will, about the Mary Speck of USIP asks about how stable is this Fujimorista coalition in Congress? Are there fissures? Are there weaknesses? I mean, we assume that this is going to sort of stay together, but, is it really stable or could it really unravel? And let me ask Gino first and then Will. And Will, maybe you could address if there's anything, outside of Peru, any external actors can, any actions that would take that may weaken this coalition. Gino?
Yes, Will has already mentioned how unusual this authoritarian drive is, considering that comes from Congress rather than from the executive branch. It's not only unusual, it's also weak because it lacks popular legitimacy and support, and because it's very difficult to manage such a broad coalition of interest. They have been managing to do it, but it's an additional weakness to its lack of social credibility and legitimacy. No. I would only add that it is an attempt to revive the authoritarian regime of the 1990s under Alberto Fujimori. Only that that hasn't been able to materialize because Keiko Fujimori lost the last 3 elections, but she could win the 4th, or an ally of hers could win the 4th, and that would be a step even further into this authoritarian strategy that, as I said before, would not be a way out to the violence and to the organized crime we are facing, but on the contrary, it could be the expression of those informal and illegal interests taking more and more power. And if you allow me, Mike, to conclude by saying that that's why the role of Patricia Benavides is so key here. Considering all we know about her, we have had Congress fighting for her survival during the last year. And it is still fighting for her survival. So, a majority of Congress are actively supporting an attorney general with a track record of Patricia Benavides and her connections through her sister with organized crime.
Gene, Will, I'm sorry, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure, I would. So I'll just underscore, I don't think this coalition in Peru is a monolith. That's, I think, the one silver lining about this new type of backsliding we're seeing, whether it's in Guatemala, Peru, or elsewhere, is that when you try to erode democracy with a large, unwieldy coalition of legislators, you're prone to get fence sitters, defectors, people who are more affected by external and bottom-up pressure than others. And I think that that's what Peruvian civil society interested in defending democracy and foreign partners need to realize right now, is that there are pressure points here, where just a little bit of pressure even can really change outcomes. I'll point to one example that's already happened. So a couple months ago, when Congress was ramping up for yet another vote on a purge of the Junta Nacional de Justicia, the National Justice Board, Senators Tim Kaine and Ben Cardin put out a strongly worded statement about how this was concerning from the standpoint of rule of law and democracy. Some Peruvian media reported that that actually contributed to enough concern among fence sitters in Congress that they decided, you know what, our interests are better served by thinking of the long term, of the future of the country, and not siding with this effort to purge the justice system. So you actually saw that purge only end up removing 2 judges as opposed to 7, and even then doing so in ways that really played fast and loose with the law, were met with subsequent legal challenge, and have produced the kind of stalemate that we see now. So that was just 2 members of the U.S. Senate speaking out. Imagine what would happen if we had a bipartisan statement. Imagine what would happen if the executive branch, the Hill, the OAS, European Union member states that are partners of Peru, we're all speaking with one voice on this, as they did in Guatemala. I think we'd see, if the threat wasn't fully contained, a much more diminished authoritarian coalition here. And then I just want to say one thing about Fujimorismo, because, I know there's a tendency by supporters of that movement to see discussions like this as sort of unfairly, treating Fuerza Popular, Fujimorismo as a punching bag, assuming its intentions are always authoritarian. I'll say just a couple of things. One, I do think that Fuerza Popular represents an important segment of public opinion in Peru. They have an important constituency of supporters. And I think there was a time in the 2000s and early 2010s when the party was experimenting with what its future would look like, whether they would try to become a post-authoritarian party like the ones we've seen in Panama, for instance, that do ultimately accept playing by democratic rules of the game, or if those commitments would be less solid. And I'm concerned that what we've seen since 2016 is a Fuerza Popular, and specifically Keiko Fujimori and her closest advisors, deciding that that recipe doesn't work for them, that they can't play by those democratic rules and win. I think that that's a very unfortunate conclusion to come to, and that it seems to me, that it's doing quite a bit of harm to the country. What I'd hope for Peru is not a future in which Fuerza Popular and Keiko Fujimori simply don't exist. I mean, they are, again, an important part of the political landscape, but one in which they come back to their senses and realize that if they play by the same democratic rules as everyone else, maybe that also serves their interests in the long run. And that this attempt to tear down a now over 20-year-old democracy that was increasingly strong is not going to work, won't serve the Peruvian people, and won't be met with silence abroad.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of extraordinarily good questions, but our time is running out, so I really apologize to those questions I couldn't get to. I want to just mention one question we got from my good friend Alan Wagner, the former foreign minister of Peru, who asked, how can we recover politics in Peru? I think that's something that all of us need to reflect on. Let me just say that another sobering statistic or some data is that as of April 30th, the National Election Board in Peru had 27 parties registered to run candidates in the next election. Another 16 parties are working on their registration. So if all the parties were to register, that would mean 43 presidential candidates in 2026, 86 vice presidential candidates, and more than 8,000 candidates for Congress. That is what we're talking about. And again, I just want to go back to the point that I made when I opened the session, which is that I think another reason to focus on Peru, for all, apart from all of the things that will very persuasively mention, is simply that it tells us where I think other countries are headed. And perhaps the word that we use to describe whether it's Argentina or Panama or Ecuador or Colombia or Chile is the word fragmentation. And I think Peru is out in front and is probably the champion in that department. And I think we should, it's useful to reflect on what the implications of that are for politics, as Alan Wagner provocatively asked all of us to consider. With that, I want to conclude this session. And again, I saw a lot of great questions, but I just want to, I want to end it on time. I want to thank Gino and Carolina and Will for this really superb, outstanding comments. Very, very informative, very stimulating, and I think excellent insights. And I want to thank Rebecca for her support for this. I want to thank Bernarda Rain for helping to set this up, and to thank all of our participants and those who posed questions and others. I think this has been a great session, and hopefully there'll be more to come. And I think if one thing we could take away from all of the comments is we shouldn't lose a focus on Peru in the midst of all the other crises that are happening in our hemisphere. It would be a mistake to ignore what's happening in Peru. So thank you all very, very much, and we'll see you the next time.